What's up guys, Justin here with TheSketchUpEssentials.com, back with another SketchUp and Twinmotion tutorial for you. So in today's video, we're going to take a model from SketchUp and we're going to take it over into Twinmotion and we're going to talk about some of the lighting and also some of the export settings that you can use in order to create different images inside of Twinmotion. So remember, this video is part of a partnership with Epic Games talking about Twinmotion. Twinmotion is a real-time rendering program that is free to download through late November. So if you download now, you get to keep that version even after the deadline. So it's a really great opportunity to get a great software and not have to pay anything for it. So if that's something you're interested in, you want to get into real-time rendering, try out Twinmotion, make sure you check out that link in the notes down below. Now let's go ahead and just jump into it. So probably some of the most important things when working and trying to create a realistic rendering is the model itself and the detail that you include in it, including all the context, the materials that you apply to it, the camera view that you set up, and then the lighting. So if you can get those things figured out, then you're probably going to be able to create a pretty good rendering. Well, in this video, I wanted to talk through the different kinds of lighting inside of Twinmotion and how you can use them to light your model. So to start off, I'm using a model from the 3D warehouse. This is the Monconse Retirement Home by Taz 1985. So if you want to download this and take it over into Twinmotion and follow along, you can definitely do that. And so the only real changes I've made to this model is I put the tree models on a layer along with the car models and I turn them off. I've also gone through using the monochrome style and I flipped a couple faces. So you always want those front faces to be facing your camera, not the back sides of your faces. And then I've also added a couple additional light poles in here. So not a ton of changes, just a few. And then all I've done is I've just used the Twinmotion extension in order to export this to Twinmotion. So I set my settings up so my collapse was set to none. I checked all of these boxes and then I just clicked this button right here for C in Twinmotion. So I've brought this into Twinmotion. I've made some additional changes. So I've added things like cars and like road striping and things like that. So all those context things that make your model look a little bit better, and I may make a video on why those things are important in the future, but for this video I wanted to talk a little bit more about the possible lighting settings. So there's really two kinds of lighting inside of Twinmotion. So the first is the environment lighting, which is the lighting that's basically created by the environment around your model, specifically the sun. Sometimes there's the moon and the stars as well and kind of the ambient light, but really that's going to be the stuff that's created by your environment. And then the other kind of lighting, which we'll talk about in a little bit, is the artificial lighting, and you can find that by going into your library and clicking on lights. And so we'll talk through what these different kinds of lights do, but I wanted to start off and talk about the lighting created by your environment. And so really when you create lighting inside of or when you bring something into Twinmotion, it's lit by an artificial sun. And so if you click on the little eye here and you adjust the daytime setting like this, you can see how there's actually an orb in the sky right up here that's casting light on your model. And so depending on where that orb is located, you're going to get different looks. So for example, like if I change my time of day, just by clicking on this and dragging this down, you can see how the sun gets higher and it casts different shadows inside of my model. So the location of my sun is what's creating the light inside of my rendering. And so you can adjust that in a couple different ways. So the first is the way we just did. You can adjust the time of day. And so that really more affects the height in the sky. So vertically is the way that I like to look at this. I like to look at it as the time of day adjusts your sun basically vertically. And then the other way you can adjust that is by going into your urban or into your nature settings and adjusting the localization. So what the localization does is that allows you to actually set where the sun would be based on a physical location. So like for example, this is set in Europe right now, but if I was to drag this over here, you can see how the sun location changes depending on where I am in the world. So as I move this up and down, you can see how my sun goes to different locations. And this is real world accurate. So if you actually want to simulate the sun and what your shadows would look like, you can do that by setting up your model with north facing north and using the localization settings in here. So and then the other thing you can do is you can adjust the time of year and the north offset. So not only can you set where you're located in the world, you can also adjust the time of year, which is going to adjust the sun location. You can see I can move this up and down because the sun is in different locations in different times of years. You can also adjust the north offset. So you can see how when I adjust the north offset, that's affecting where the shadows are cast because that's affecting where the sun is in the sky. So you can kind of see it moving around. If I adjust the north offset here, the sun's kind of in this direction, but if I rotate it around, it's actually behind me, casting the light onto my building. So you can use the sun location to create shadows and set how bright your model or your rendering is going to be. And then you can also save those settings when you create an image, which we'll talk about a little bit later. And so one thing I want to point out about that is when you go in and you adjust the weather settings. So when you click on nature and go into weather and you click this slider, you can see how at a certain point, if you get enough clouds in here, they're actually going to block your sun. So you can see how based on where those clouds are located, they'll block your sun and your image will get darker. So you can also use the cloud settings in here to adjust the way that your sunlight is going to be shining and things like that as well. So, and that's something you just kind of have to play around with. I'm hoping at some point they give you the ability to adjust where the clouds are, because like right now, for example, if I adjust my localization, you can see how you can have your sun orb in the sky, and then you can adjust this, and at a certain point your sun orb gets blocked and this gets dimmer. But it would be really nice to actually like manually adjust these clouds, which is not something you can do at the moment. It's just they're either in or they're out. So just be aware of that, and you can use that setting to create different effects in here. We'll talk a little bit later about using the precipitation effect to create kind of a wet pavement look, so that you can reflect light and kind of add some interest to your scene. But so that's how you can use the environment lighting in order to light your model. So the other way that you can do this, and I have kind of a preset image set up that's kind of dark at nighttime. So not only can you use the environment settings in order to light your model, you can also use different kinds of artificial lights. So you can see how if you look off on the left-hand side, if you go into your library and you click on lights, there's multiple different kinds of lights in here. So, and really generally speaking, there's mostly 4 different kinds of lights. Depending on how you look at it, there could be 5 different kinds of lights inside of Twinmotion. So the artificial lights, I mean. So the first is an omnidirectional light. So if I drag an omnidirectional light into my scene and I go down and look at it, you can see how an omni light or an omnidirectional light is basically a light that's going to cast light in all different directions. So it's like a point in space that puts light out. And so you can see how when you select this light, you can adjust how bright or how dim it is using this slider. So, and you don't necessarily want to turn these like way up in here. You can kind of affect your ambient brightness and other things like that with other settings. You want to try to get as close to real world lighting as you can. So like real world lumen settings and things like that. But you can adjust things like how this light reflects. So how strongly the light is reflected off of different surfaces. You can also use the slider to adjust the color of your light. So you can use this to create kind of a warm light or kind of a cool light. You can also actually adjust your color in here. So you can actually go into your colors and adjust what color of light is cast by this light. And so the Omni light also allows you to adjust the radius, so how far out the light goes and how far out it affects different things. So you can see how as I drag this further up, this light is going to affect more things. However, one thing you need to be aware of is if you have a ton of these lights in here and you've got this like way wide for all of them, it is going to be a little bit harder on your processor because they're just affecting more things. So if you keep this small, you can see how this is affecting having less stuff, and this is going to have less calculations you have to run. Or if you make it a little bit bigger, you can see how that's going to affect more things, and it's going to be a little bit harder on your processor. In addition to this, all of the lights have the option to turn shadows on and off. So by default, these are set to off. So a lot of these lights don't cast shadows. And part of that is a performance thing again, because shadows take a little bit more performance. So shadows are a little bit harder on your computer. They require a little bit more from a calculation standpoint. So I would say turn this on where you need these. But if you have lights like way off in the distance, like this one, and you can see how these have an S next to them right now because shadows are turned on, but you might want to consider turning those shadows off for those lights, just so that your processor isn't trying to do all those calculations over here. So, and then finally, you can set these with a day cycle, meaning they'll turn off during daytime and they'll turn on during nighttime. So if you want these to cycle on and off, depending on if it's day or night, you can adjust that over here. So, and then one other thing about most of the lights in here is if you click on the button for more, under the light settings, there's an option to load a IES file in here. So an IES file is basically an information file that gives Twinmotion information about the light. So if you want to try to simulate real world lighting, you can usually get those files from like lighting manufacturer websites and things like that. So if you load in this IES file, that's going to make this light more realistic, and it'll actually have the properties of a light in the real world. So we talked a little bit about the omnidirectional light. Now let's talk a little bit about a spotlight. So where an omnidirectional light has a point that radiates in all different directions, a spotlight is actually a light that has a direction. So it points in a certain direction. So you can see how as I move this up, this particular light has these 4 points right here. And I'm going to turn the intensity up just so we can see this a little bit better. But you can see how as I drag this up and down, there's actually an option for attenuation. You can see how this actually shows you the direction that this light is pointing. So while an omnidirectional light points in all different directions, this kind of light, a spotlight, actually shines based on what direction you have it pointing in a physical world. So you can set the angle that this light radiates out on each of your spotlights as well. And so you can see how you can set this attenuation option to set how far out this light radiates. So you can see how this actually gives you a 3D indication of where that light is going to go based on your attenuation settings. So for now, and this is way too bright, and that's okay for this example, we're going to leave this as is, and you can see how I've set this to attenuate the light all the way out here. And then just like the other light, you can set shadows based on this light's location as well, or you can turn those off depending on what you're trying to do. So, and then the neon light is more like a strip light. So it's actually like a strip of light in a 3D space that radiates light outwards. So you can see how while these others either are a point or they are you can see how while the others are coming from a point of light or they have a direction, this one is more of a strip of light. And you can adjust that length by moving this way. So moving your length in and out. You can also set if this casts shadows as well as the light color on this one as well. So it acts a lot the same way, but if you have like a long strip or something like that, then you're going to want to use the neon light. And so you can see how you're getting the reflection off of the wet pavement effect right here. And that's one thing to note about this. And we'll turn all of our artificial lights on for a second. With your wet pavement effect, or really any effect where things are actually reflective, your light is actually going to reflect off of various surfaces. So you can see how, for example, you're actually getting the reflection of this strip of light off of the glossy paint on this car. So those are the three, or if you count the IES lights. So these IES lights are basically like spotlights. So they're not really that different than the spotlights that are already in here. Really, if you're trying to get an IES specific effect, you can load that into your spotlight, or you can see how these actually act different ways depending on the light that you load in. So you can kind of play around with these, but they're generally the same as the spotlight, just with some a little bit of difference in the style that they create. So then the last kind of light I want to talk about is an emitter. And so an emitter isn't an artificial light that's in your lights over here, but rather it's a material. And basically it's a material that emits light. And really you can set any material to be an emitter. So for example, if I use my material picker and I adjust to for example, if I was to select this concrete slabs material and I was to go into my settings, there's actually an option for glow. And so you can see how as I click and drag this up, this would make my concrete material actually emit light. So you can see how this this concrete material is now emitting light. Now obviously we don't actually want our concrete to emit light. I've applied an emitter material to this light, and I've coupled that with my spotlights so that not only am I getting lighting from my spotlights, I'm also getting the effect of this being an actual light in the real world. And so these don't cast shadows, they just have a brightness associated with them. You can see how I can move this up and down to adjust how strong that effect is. But you can make any material an emitter by messing around with the glow settings, or you can also go into your materials and there's a few different neon lights in here that you can apply. So for example, you can see how this neon light material actually flashes. And you can adjust the brightness or the speed of that flashing using the speed button, but there's also different like police lights or multicolored neon lights, so different kinds of lights in here that you can apply that actually have like a strobe effect. So if that's something you want, you can apply those in here as well. So under neons, there's a few different options. So generally speaking, I find myself using just the neon one. It's just kind of a standard, and you can add that strobe effect by adjusting the speed or not. So emitters are just materials that you set up to emit light. And so that's kind of an overview of the different lighting settings in here. What I wanted to do now is just talk through a few of the different settings associated with your lighting inside the images that you create. So if you remember, you create your images by clicking on media right here, and then under image you click on create image. And so each one of these images has different lighting settings associated with it. So you can see how in here I have a night render that's set up, and I've applied kind of a wet pavement effect in here. I also have a day render that has the sunlight settings set up in a way where the model is lit like that as well. And for that one I have most of my artificial lights turned off. But basically what you do is you just adjust these settings inside of your images. So like for example, for my day render, if I click on my time, I can set the time of day, and then also with the time of day I can set the way that the shadows are cast inside of this image. So one thing to point out, probably one of the biggest things I see from people that makes things unrealistic, is they get this sunlight shining on this big open face like this, and it just kind of looks uninterrupted, and in real life big uninterrupted faces don't really exist. So I like to use my lighting settings to try to break that up with shadows and other things like that wherever possible. So just things that make this a little bit more realistic. But then once you set your daytime settings, you could go in here and you can see how you have different settings in here like your localization. So for example, if you wanted this to have a different north offset or something like that, you can adjust that inside of the actual image itself. So you can also adjust your weather settings. So I've kind of dragged this over so I have a wet pavement effect. So you'll see the wet pavement effect a lot in different renderings just because it really kind of breaks up this pavement material. So all I did is I just clicked and dragged this from over here. At a minimum, I like to have some clouds in the background, but I drag this over here, and what you get is this after rain effect where lighting is being reflected off of this wet pavement, which makes this a more interesting image. So you can also adjust your various different lighting settings for the overall world. So by clicking on lighting, you can adjust how bright the sun is, as well as how light the ambient light is. So that's basically all the areas that are being lit just by the environment lighting, not by direct sunlight. You can adjust all of those different settings inside of your lighting settings. So you can also adjust if this has a warmer feel or a cooler feel, and how strongly light is reflecting off of different surfaces by adjusting this GI setting. So the moon power we'll talk about in a second. You can also adjust how sharp or not sharp your shadows are by clicking and dragging this slider right here. So you can see how if I click and drag this up, this light this shadow that's being cast by this light pole isn't very strongly defined. If I drag it down, to maybe like right here, you can see how this has much sharper edges. So you can adjust how those shadows look using this option. And then the last option I want to look at for the daytime settings is if I click and drag this up and down, you can see how this is adjusting how dark the shadows are in the little detailed areas, so like the nooks and crannies and things like that. You can see how this kind of sharpens those shadows, and I usually like to leave that at 50 or above, but you just get more detailed shadows inside of your model if you turn your ambient occlusion up. And so then we can take a quick look at my night render settings. They're not that different than my day settings. What I've done is I've set my time to like an early morning, and then I've gone in here and really what I've done is I've set my weather so that I get kind of this post-rain effect, so that I'm getting some light shining off of the streets. So if you don't have the light shining off of the streets, your rendering looks fine, but everything just looks kind of smooth and it's just not really realistic. So all of my roads and my sidewalks just don't look as good. Where if I drag this off to the right, and I don't want this to have the precipitation settings on the face of my model, but if I drag this off to the right here where I still have clouds, but I have kind of this wet pavement effect, you can see how it's just a much more interesting rendering in here. So I also have all of my lights turned on. You can see I've added some point lights inside of my building, so I have my light coming out of those as if there were people in here. So that's something that really adds something to your renderings, is by adding those different point lights in here. And then overall what I've done is I've turned my ambient lighting up a fair amount. So I just want kind of the overall scene to be a little bit brighter. So I've turned that ambient lighting up so I get some more environment lighting in here. And I've also turned my moon up a fair amount. So you can see how the brighter your moon is, it's almost like having the sun in here. It casts a little bit of a shadow on your walls. And then if you want to, you can click on this more button and you can add some stars in the background as well. A lot of that is just going to kind of depend on the effect that you're trying to create. So overall, all that I've really done is I've just added a whole bunch of artificial lights in here, and I like, it seems like the more artificial lights you add in here in realistic places, the better your night renderings are going to look. But so I'm going to take both of these now, and I'm just going to export them so that you can take a look at the final render, and then we'll call it good. So remember to render, you're just going to go to the export settings, and in this case I'm just going to check the box for my day render and my night render so I can render them both, and I'm just going to click on the start export button, and that's going to allow me to select a folder. So I'm going to select that folder, and we're just going to export these two renderings to that folder. So here's my day render settings. So there's probably some things I'd like to clean up with the way that the material is being mapped in here. But overall, I think this gives you kind of a good indication of what this building's going to look like. And then for my night render, you can see how I've got this really nice pavement effect in here and all the light reflecting off of my cars. One thing I might do is I might turn my camera angle this way a little bit because I've got my city in the background. This looks a little bit weird where everything just kind of stops before the trees. So I might adjust this so I get more city and less random trees in the background. But overall, I really like this effect, and all I had to do was just bring this in and add some artificial lights into my rendering. So that's where I'm going to end this video. Leave a comment below. Let me know what you thought. Have you been using Twinmotion for night renderings? Are you liking it so far? I just love having that conversation with you guys. If you like this video, please remember to click that like button down below. If you're new around here, remember to click that subscribe button for new SketchUp content every week. If you like what I'm doing on this channel, please consider supporting me on Patreon. Every little bit helps, even if it's only $1 a month. So make sure you check out that link in the notes down below. But in any case, thank you so much for taking the time to watch this. I really appreciate it, and I will catch you in the next video. Thanks, guys.